pregnant and sold to a brothel for 10 coins. A Lakota chief bought her and became father to her child. I will tell you what happened the winter I was 49 years old, because my son asks me sometimes why his skin is lighter than mine, and his eyes are the color of creek water in summer, and I think he is old enough now to hear it straight. His name is Chayton. It means falcon. His mother gave him a white name too for the days he walks in towns. Thomas Chayton. He is 17. He is already a better horseman than most men I have known, and he has his mother's patience and her habit of watching a thing for a long time before she speaks about it. He has my hands wide, the knuckles already scarred even at his age, and when he is angry he goes very quiet, and that is also mine. I am telling you this so you understand. Before I tell you what the boy came from, you should know what he became. That is more important than the other. Now the winter. I had ridden 6 days south of the Powder River country, toward the fort settlement they called Red Hook. It was December. The high plains were frozen iron under the horses' hooves, and the sky was the color of old bone. And I had with me only my cousin Lame Elk and a man named Crow Shirt who was not Crow at all but Arapaho, and who had taken the name as a joke 15 years before, and kept it because it made people uneasy. We were 3 men, well armed, on business that had nothing to do with what I am about to tell you. We were tracking a string of horses that had been taken from our camp 6 weeks prior by men whose names I knew. That was the only reason I was in that country. The horses. Red Hook was not a proper town. It was a trading post, a stable, 3 buildings that called themselves saloons, a blacksmith who also pulled teeth, and a structure at the east end of the main cut of dirt that had no sign on it but that everyone knew. I had been to Red Hook twice before. I knew what that building was. We came in at midday. The cold had kept most men inside. There was smoke from every chimney, and a smell of coal and boiled meat and horse dung that hit you the moment you cleared the last ridge. 2 men stood in the doorway of the largest saloon watching us ride in. They did not look friendly, but they did not reach for anything. That was as good as it was going to be. I left Lame Elk and Crow Shirt at the stable with the horses, and told them to ask about the stolen string, carefully, in the way you ask about a thing in a place like that, sideways, as though you are only curious, as though you could not care less about the answer. They knew how. I walked toward the trading post. I heard her before I saw what was happening. Not crying. She was not crying. It was a sound harder than that, a woman making no sound at all, and the sound of it was in the silence between a man's raised voice and the crack of something hitting something else. I have heard that kind of silence my whole life, and I have never once been able to walk past it. I turned toward the east end of the street. There were 4 men and the woman. The men I did not know. The woman was young, she could not have been more than 22, maybe younger, and she was standing in the mud and frozen ruts outside the building with no sign, and she was wearing a coat that was too thin for that weather, and her hands were wrapped around her belly, the way a woman wraps her hands around her belly when it is full of a child. She was very far along. 7 months, I thought then. I was wrong, it was closer to 8. One of the men was talking and pointing at the building, and she was shaking her head. Another man had hold of her wrist, not hard yet, but with the intention of harder. The 4th man was standing slightly apart, holding a small amount of paper money, and looking at it like a man who has just sold something and is not entirely satisfied with the price, but intends to take it anyway. I stood in the street, and I watched this for perhaps 10 seconds. I want to be honest about what I felt. It was not heroism. It was not some noble fire. It was a cold, specific anger that I have had in me my whole life, and that I do not entirely trust because it has caused me trouble. My father had it, his father before him. When I see a thing that is wrong, not complicated wrong, not the kind of wrong where reasonable men can disagree, but simply, plainly, undeniably wrong, something in me becomes very still and very decided. And after that the decision is already made even if I have not yet thought about whether it is wise. I walked to the east end of the street. The man holding her wrist saw me first. He did not let go. He said something in the quick, low way men talk to each other when they want to communicate a problem without admitting there is one. The other three turned. I stopped about 8 feet from them. I said in English, which I spoke then about as well as I speak it now, "How much did you pay for her?" The man with the paper money looked at me. He was somewhere near 40. He had a beard that had gone past the point of intention into neglect, and eyes that were flat and incurious in the way of a man who has made many bad decisions without much suffering for them. He said, "None of your concern, Chief." I said, "How much?" The man holding her wrist said something to the others about what I could do with my question. I looked at the woman. She had turned her face toward me. She had brown hair that was damp with cold and her eyes were gray-green, the color, I said, creek water in summer, and she was looking at me not with hope, not yet, but with the particular attention of a person who has been in a very bad situation for some time and has learned to notice anything that might or might not change it. She was measuring me. That is what I remember. She was measuring me even then, from that first moment, even with the man's hand on her wrist and her belly full and her coat too thin. She was not collapsed. She was calculating. I said to the man with the paper, "I will buy her from you." He blinked. Behind him, I heard one of the others make a sound that was almost a laugh. He said, "She ain't yours to buy. She belongs to," and he pointed his chin at the building. I said, "You have paper money in your hand. That means you have already been paid for her. Whatever you were paid, I will pay you again, and she comes with me." He looked at the money in his hand. He looked at me. Men like that, I have met enough of them. They run a quick calculation that has nothing to do with morality and everything to do with what they think they can get away with, balanced against what they think it will cost them. I was one man. I was Lakota, which in that country at that time meant something specific about what could happen to me if I caused trouble, and they knew it and I knew it, and we all stood there knowing it together. But I had been a chief for 11 years. I had stood in councils with men who would have eaten those 4 for breakfast. I did not move. I did not shift my weight. I held his eyes and I waited. He said, $10. I said, $10. He said it again, slower. $10 and she's yours, her and whatever she's carrying. I paid him. I reached into my coat and I counted out $10 in paper and I held it out and he took it and I put my hand on the woman's arm, on her other arm, not the wrist the other man was holding, and I said to her quietly, looking at her face, "I am not this man. You understand? I am not this kind of man. You can come with me or you can stay. I will not drag you." She looked at me for about 2 seconds. She said, "I'll come." Her name was Nora. I did not learn her family name for 3 days, and when I did learn it, I will not tell you now because it does not matter to this story. And because the man who carried that name had sold her for $10 to a brothel, and as far as I am concerned, she ended that name in the mud in front of that building, and what she carries now is better. Lame Elk looked at me when I came back to the stable with her, and I looked at him and he said nothing, which was correct. We could not ride fast, not with her as she was. We made it perhaps 12 miles before the light went gray and then black, and we camped in a draw out of the wind with a fire that we built low and flat so the smoke would not carry. I had a blanket I gave her. Lame Elk had a second. We had dried meat and pemmican and crow shirt made a thin soup with snow melt and some roots he carried. She ate without speaking for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, looking at the fire, "How far is it to the next town?" I said, "We are not going to a town." She looked at me. I said, "There is no town in that direction that is safe for you right now. The man you came from, I do not know his reach, but I know that country." I looked at the fire too. "We are going north, to our winter camp. You will be safe there, and when you have delivered your child safely, I will help you go wherever you want to go." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You don't know me." I said no. She said I might be trouble. I said, you are pregnant and alone in December, and you were just sold to a house of men for $10. I believe I understand your situation. She looked at me then with an expression I did not entirely understand. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more complicated. As though she was deciding whether to be angry that someone had simply stated what her situation was, or whether to be relieved that someone had stated it plainly without dressing it up in pity. She said, all right. That was the first night. The 6 days north were not easy. She did not complain, which surprised me. She was cold and she was tired and she was very pregnant and she did not complain about any of it. She asked questions instead, about where we were going, about how many people were in my camp, about whether there was a woman there who had delivered children, about the horses. She knew horses, I realized, more than most of the white men I had dealt with. She asked Crow's shirt about his name on the second day, and when he told her the joke she laughed, a real laugh, the first time I had heard it. I watched her, not the way men watch women, the way you watch someone who has surprised you and whom you are trying to understand. By the third day I knew several things about her. She was not soft. She had been raised on a farm somewhere in Kansas, she said once, and had come west at 18 with a man she had believed would be a husband and who had not been. She did not say what had happened to him. She had been in that part of the territory for 4 years, working, she said it plain, not apologetically, not with shame, working in one house and another, and she had ended up in Red Hook when her money ran out and her situation became visible, and the woman who ran the house she was in decided she was no longer an asset, and sold her to the man with the flat eyes who had not been able to place her somewhere else and had taken what he could. She said all of this the way you talk about weather, not performing toughness, just done with pretending it was something other than what it was. I said, the child's father. She said, gone. I did not ask more than that. She said after a while, it's a boy. I know it. I said, how do you know? She said, I just know, the way he moves. I thought about that for the rest of that day's riding. We came into the winter camp on the 6th day, late in the afternoon, when the light was low and orange and the lodges were throwing shadows long across the snow. There were perhaps 40 lodges. Children came running first, the way they always do, and then the dogs, and then the people who were curious came to the edges of things and looked. I have been a chief since I was 38. I became one not because I was born to it, but because enough people trusted my judgment enough times in difficult situations that eventually it became formal. I do not say this to brag about myself. I say it because you need to understand what it meant when I brought this woman into my camp. People would talk, that was certain. Some would not like it, that was also certain. There were women in that camp who had opinions about white women, and those opinions were not without cause. They had good reasons for every one of them, and I did not dismiss those reasons then or now. I was asking something of my people by bringing her in. I knew that, I brought her anyway. There was a woman in my camp named Stands Looking, who was 60 years old and had delivered more children than she could count on both hands. I went to her lodge that first evening before I did anything else. I told her what I needed. She looked at me for a long time without speaking, the way she did when she was deciding what she thought about something. Then she said, how far along? I said, close, very close. She said, you picked a fine time. I said, I know. She stood up and got her things. The child came 11 days after we reached camp. I was not there for the birth. Men are not generally. I know only what Stands Looking told me afterward, which was that it was hard, harder than average, she said, long and difficult, and that the woman had been very frightened but had not screamed. She made noise, Stands Looking said, but she never screamed. I remember she said it with a particular expression that meant she considered it a mark of something. It was a boy, as Nora had known. He was small. Stan's looking said he was well-made but small, and that he would be fine if he ate well and kept warm. She stayed with Nora for 3 days and taught her things without being asked, the way to hold him, the way to feed him in the cold, what to watch for. I do not know exactly what passed between them in those 3 days. I only know that when I went to the lodge that third evening, Nora was sitting with the child at her breast, and Stan's looking was sitting across from her, and neither of them was talking, and the silence between them was not an uncomfortable one. I sat down. I looked at the boy. He was sleeping. His face was very red and very new, and his fist was closed around nothing. His hair was dark, nearly as dark as mine. I said to Nora, "You said you knew it would be a boy." She said, "I told you." I said, "What will you call him?" She looked at the child for a long time. She said, "I want a name from your language, if you'll give me one." I looked at her. She said, "He was born here. He was born safe because of you. I'd like him to carry something of that." I thought about it for a while, then I said, "Chaitin." She said, "What does it mean?" I said, "Falcon." She said it quietly, trying it, "Chaitin." Then she looked at me and she said, "Will you name him? Is that something you can do here, formally?" I held the boy's eyes for a moment, then looked at Nora. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." She said, "Then will you?" I said, "Yes." That was not a small thing. I want you to understand that. In my people's understanding of such things, to name a child, to stand as the one who names him, is not a formality. It is a claim and a responsibility both. It is saying, "I will answer for this child. I am tied to him now and he to me." I knew what I was agreeing to. I agreed to it. The formal naming happened 4 days later when Nora was strong enough to be present for it. I will not tell you the details of the ceremony because some things are not for outside ears. I will tell you what mattered. I held Chaitin while I spoke his name the first time in the formal way. He was very awake. He looked up at me with his gray-green eyes. Already his mother's color was in them, and he had his fist against his mouth, and he was watching me with the absolute serious focus that very new children have, as though they are trying to remember your face for a long time. I said his name. He said nothing, which is correct, since he was 17 days old. But I felt something that I do not have a word for in English and will not try to translate. It was like a door closing, not in a bad way. The way a door closes when you are inside and the cold is outside and the fire is going and the door closes and the cold is on one side of it and you are on the other. Something settled. She stayed through the winter. I had told her she could go when spring came if she wanted. I meant it sincerely. I had no intention of holding her. She was a free woman and I had treated her as one from the beginning. She did not go in spring. She did not say anything about it. Spring came and the camp shifted south toward the better grass and she packed her things and came with us, carrying Chaitin, and that was that. She did not make an announcement. She simply continued. I watched this and said nothing for a while. About 6 weeks into the spring movement, I came back to camp one evening from a long day of scouting the horsegrass situation, and she had made food. She did this sometimes. She had been learning from the women in camp quietly, without making a project of it, just watching and doing until she could do it herself. She had learned to cook 2 or 3 things our way. She handed me the bowl and sat across from it and fed Chaitin while I ate, and we talked about what I had seen that day, the way you talk with someone you live with, without ceremony. I looked at her across the fire. I said, "You had planned to leave in spring." She looked up. I said, "I am not asking you to stay. I told you from the beginning you were free. I am only asking what your thinking is." She was quiet for a moment. Chaitin had his fist around her finger and was working at it with his gums. She said, "Where would I go?" I said, "That is not a reason to stay. That is a reason not to leave. They are different things." She looked at me directly. She said, "You're right. They're different things." She looked at the fire and then back at me. "I stay because this is where Chayton is safe, and because—" She stopped. Then she said it plain, the way she said everything. "Because you have been good to me. Better than anyone has been to me in a long time, maybe ever. And I am not so stupid that I walk away from a good thing because I have some idea in my head about what my life was supposed to look like." I held her eyes. I said, "You are welcome here, for as long as you want." She said, "I know that, you've shown me." She went back to Chayton and I went back to my food, and neither of us said anything else about it that night. But something between us had become plainer. Not soft, plainer. Like when you have been going around a thing for a while, and finally you go directly at it. And after that the territory makes more sense. There's something I should tell you about what it meant in that camp for things to develop the way they developed. I had been widowed for 3 years when I brought Nora to camp. My wife, her name was Wind Comes, had died of a sickness that went through our people 2 winters before. She had been a good woman and I had loved her, and her death had taken something from me that I had not been in any hurry to replace. The people in my camp had opinions about Nora. Not all of them were friendly. A few of the women, early on, kept their distance. An older man named Yellow Knife said something to me one evening about the wisdom of what I was doing that I listened to and disagreed with, but listened to, because he was not entirely wrong that there would be complications, and I knew it. But something happened over that winter and spring that I had not entirely predicted. Nora worked. That is the thing. She did not sit in the lodge and wait to be kept. She watched what the women did and she did it alongside them. She made mistakes and she accepted correction without sulking. She asked questions without shame. She was strong, I had understood that from the first night, but it turned out she was also patient, which is a different kind of strength and rarer. She learned our language piecemeal, words and then phrases, and then eventually something that passed for conversation. And she made people laugh sometimes, even the ones who had not been easy about her presence. Chayton helped. A child does that, opens things between people. The women who had been cool to Nora were not cool to Chayton, because he was impossible not to be warm to, and warmth toward the child is warmth toward the mother, eventually. By the following winter she was not a stranger in that camp. I do not say she was fully one of us, that takes generations, and I am not going to lie to you about how these things work. But she was known, and she was respected, and people trusted her, and she trusted them, and that is not a small thing. Yellow Knife came to me that second winter, and said that he had been wrong to say what he said. I told him he had not been entirely wrong, only that the complications had gone differently than he predicted. He said that was the same as being wrong. I said I supposed it was. He laughed. Yellow Knife had a laugh like something falling off a wagon. I have always liked it. The thing that changed between Nora and me is not something I will describe in detail because it is private, and because I am an old man, and I do not see the need to put everything out in the open air. I will tell you what you need to know. We became close over that second winter in the way that 2 people become close when they have been living alongside each other long enough, that the daily texture of each other is familiar. Her particular way of moving in the morning, the way she hummed when she was working, the way she sometimes sat for a long time looking at nothing when she was thinking something through. My habits she knew too. She knew that I woke at first light and sat outside before I spoke to anyone. She knew that I was not comfortable with a thing until I had been quiet with it for a while. She knew about the anger, the cold, specific kind, and she did not treat it as a problem to be managed. She acknowledged it plainly and went on. That was more than most people had ever done. One evening in late January I came in from outside and she was sitting with Chayton asleep in her arms and the fire low and the lodge very quiet. She looked up at me. I sat down beside her, closer than I usually sat. She looked back at the fire. After a long time she said, "Are you going to tell me what you're thinking, or do I have to guess?" I said, I am thinking that I have been alone for 3 years and that I am not alone anymore, and I am thinking about what that means. She said, "What does it mean?" I said, "I do not know yet. I am sitting with it." She said very quietly, "Take your time." I did. I sat with it for another 3 weeks, because that is how I am, and then one evening I told her what I had concluded, which was that I wanted her to stay not as a woman who was welcome in my camp, but as something more permanent than that. I said it plainly, and I did not dress it in anything. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I've been thinking the same thing since about October." I said, "October?" She said, "I told you, I'm not stupid enough to walk away from a good thing." Then she looked at me with an expression I have been looking at for 18 years since that night, and which I still do not entirely have a word for, not warmth only, not love only, though it is both of those. It is the look of someone who has decided you are worth deciding on. Freely, with full knowledge of what they are deciding. That is what I see in it. She decided on me and she has not looked away. She put her hand on my arm. The fire crackled and Chayton slept, and outside the wind was doing what wind does in late January on the high plains, which is everything it wants. But inside the lodge it was warm and quiet, and she had her hand on my arm, and I put my hand over hers, and that was how it was. There are men who will not understand what I am telling you. Men who will hear that I bought a woman from a brothel man for $10 and think they understand what kind of story that is. They will think they know what it was. They do not know. I bought her freedom. I did not buy her. She has never been mine in the way that those men in Red Hook thought of owning. She chose. Everything she has done since that first night in the draw, she has done by choice. I made sure of that, made sure she knew she could leave, made sure she had what she needed to leave if she wanted, made sure there was never a wall between her and the door. She stayed because she wanted to stay. That is the only way it means anything. A woman who stays because she has to is not a woman who has given you anything. A woman who stays because she wants to, who has looked at all of it clearly and decided you are worth staying for, that is something else. That is the whole thing. I am 67 years old. I have done difficult things and good things and things I regret, and things I would do again exactly the same. I have led men in situations where the decisions I made meant whether they lived or died. I have negotiated with white officials who did not want to hear what I had to say, but had to hear it anyway. I have lost people I loved and grieved them correctly and gone on. I have lived a life that has required something from me every single day of it. None of it has mattered more than this, that I did not walk past that east end of the street in Red Hook, that I counted out $10 and said to a woman in a thin coat in the mud, "You can come with me or you can stay," that she said yes, that I kept my word, that she kept hers. Chayton came to me when he was about 11 or 12, I cannot remember exactly, and asked me if I was his real father. I thought about the question for a while before I answered it. I said, "What is a real father?" He looked at me. He had his mother's patience. He sat with the question instead of objecting to it. He said, "Someone who was there when you needed him, someone who didn't leave." I said, "Then yes, I am your real father." He thought about that. He said, "What about the other one?" I said, "He left. That is what I know about him. Your mother knows more, and if you want to ask her, you should. But as far as I am concerned, a man who leaves is not in the accounting." He said, "Did you know about him when you took us in?" I said, "No, I knew about your mother." That was enough. He looked at me for a long time with that serious gray-green gaze of his. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because she was in the street in the cold and she needed someone to stand between her and what was coming at her, and I was there and I could. That is all. It does not need to be more than that." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I want to be like that." I said, "Like what?" He said, "Like you, someone who doesn't walk past." I looked at my son for a long moment, 17 years of him, the weight of the name I gave him, his mother's eyes, my hands. I said, "Then be that." He said, "Yes, sir." And that was the end of the conversation. I did not find all the stolen horses that winter, if you are wondering. We found 11 of the 23, which was better than nothing but not what I had wanted. The 3 men who took them were dealt with the following spring in a separate matter I will not go into here. That part of the story ended the way those parts of stories generally end. The horses were good horses. The ones we found were in acceptable condition considering. But that is not the part I remember when I think about that winter. I remember the woman in the thin coat measuring me from the mud. I remember the sound of Chayton breathing in the lodge at night, very new, the sound so small it barely reached me. I remember Stan's looking at me over the fire and saying, "You picked a fine time," and meaning it as criticism and also as something else, as the kind of observation a wise person makes about a fool who happened to be right. I remember 18 years of evenings, with Nora's hand somewhere near mine. I remember the weight of my son in my arms the day I named him, his gray-green eyes wide open, watching me like I was something worth watching. I am 67 and I have had a life that has required something from me every day of it. I would not change a day of it, not one. Chayton. Falcon. That is his name, and I gave it to him, and he carries it well.